Hello, everyone. I'm Jim Garrison. I want to welcome you to this session of Humanity Rising as we begin a 5-day program on human flourishing in our modern world. What does it mean to flourish in a world caught up in hypercomplexity? So we'll be delving into this over the next number of days for this week. And we want, as we begin this discussion of flourishing, to focus our attention, as we have over the last several weeks, on what is going on in Gaza as the Israeli government prepares for its final assault, final conquest, final solution of the Palestinians in Gaza. And just so everyone's on the same page as we begin this week, over the last 4 months, the Israelis have been bombing from north to south, forcing the Palestinians further and further south, destroying everything in their wake, promising that Rafah would be a safe haven. And now 1.5 million Palestinians out of a population of 2.3 million Palestinians are concentrated in the southern border of Gaza, in the city of Rafah, which before the war started was a city of about 200,000. And now it's got 1.5 million hungry, starving people, without food, without water, without sanitation, living in tents, and being randomly bombed from the air with drones and Israeli snipers who have been randomly attacking mostly women and children to spread terror. And now there's nowhere to go. I want to explore what genocide means by recounting what happened to Al-Azhar University, which until about 10 days ago was one of 12 universities serving the 2.3 million Palestinians in Gaza. It was the last university to be standing. It was captured by the Israelis several months ago, used it as a interrogation and torture center. Snipers were on the roofs shooting people at random. Over 3,000 precious artifacts in its museum dating back to ancient Palestine and Phoenicia were all pillaged and destroyed and looted by the Israeli soldiers. And then on January 17th, the Israelis seeded the entire university with 315 mines and blew the whole university up, which is what they did to the other 11 universities and what they've done to the 250 government kindergartens, primary schools, and high schools, and what they've done to the 65 UN schools for the Palestinians in Gaza. Genocide is not only the attempt to kill people, kill civilians, kill children. It's the attempt to wipe out a culture by destroying anything that would remind the inhabitants of who they are and the richness of the tradition that they have inherited. The vice president of Al Izra University and some of his family, others being killed, are now homeless, foodless, waterless in Rafah. And Netanyahu has ordered the final assault. And the Brigadier General Goldfuss, in charge of the operation, says there are no orders to spare any civilians. This is what genocide is. And it's happening live on TV with the full support of the US government. I've mentioned before, and I will continue to mention it almost every day, what we are witnessing, my friends, is a trans-historical crime. It marks the second time that Israelites have come into Palestine and committed genocide. The first time was under the leadership of Joshua, around 1200 BC. You can read the account in the book of Joshua in the Old Testament. To conquer the land, they killed every man, woman, and child, the animals, poisoned the wells, and cut down the sacred trees. And Netanyahu, the ministers of his government, all think they're Joshua because they have forgotten that they are not the sons of Joshua, that the Jews are the sons and daughters of Abraham and Isaac and Jacob, who came in first into that holy place. And they came in friendship, to trade, to share hospitality, to be generous, to be tolerant, and even to share their gods, while not giving up their belief in their own. That tolerance has been lost. And so what we're witnessing with an excruciation of heart that almost is beyond words. We're watching the Israelis do to the Palestinians what the Germans did to the Jews 100 years ago in the 1920s and the 1930s, with the same tactics, the same rhetoric, the same goal: genocide. And when I mean trans-historical, I mean an event that stands outside history, generation after generation. What's happening in Gaza today, as we speak, is of equal proportion to what happened 2,000 years ago when Jesus of Nazareth was crucified. That's what trans-historical means. It's an event inside time. It's an event outside time. And if the Jewish people stand by and let Netanyahu and his psychotic ministers complete the utter destruction of Rafah and the decimation of 1.5 million defenseless Palestinians, they are as culpable as the Germans were with the Nazis. And that holds true for every single one of us. Because when you are dealing with genocide, you're dealing with the ultimate crime, which is depriving other people of their existence, not because of what they did, but because of who they are. And if the world allows this to take place, none of us have the right to call ourselves civilized. And the destruction of Rafah, like the final solution 100 years ago, will stain not only the house of Israel, but the United States and the European countries, which are the only countries in the world supporting what Israel is doing and blocking every attempt to even have a ceasefire. If this is of the magnitude of what happened 2,000 years ago, then Joe Biden is Pontius Pilate. Radical Jewish leaders then allied themselves with the Roman Imperium to do the deed against who everyone knew was an innocent man. And now the Netanyahu government, allying itself with the Imperium, does it again to who everyone knows are mostly defenseless women and children. So every day we're going to look at what's going on in Rafah and in Gaza. And the one glimmer that came up today was a Dutch court ruled that the Dutch government cannot send more F-16s to Israel because they're going to be used for crimes against humanity. That's the first bright glimmer in an otherwise devastatingly dark situation. So I would urge everyone, before the day is out, to call the White House, call your senator, House of Representative member, if you're in the United States. If you live in Europe, call whoever you can and tell them to stop the genocide. There are aid agencies, and I'll put the link in the chat box so that people can send money, which is currently being blocked. But organizations like Doctors Without Borders are working through surrogates as best they can to help the situation there. So there is something that we can all do. And I appeal directly to every Jew listening to this statement. Because you're a Jew, to say, you are not sons and daughters of Joshua. You are sons and daughters of Abraham and Isaac and Jacob, and the Jewish people need to renounce what is happening by the Israeli government and separate themselves from genocide. And I say this strategically. Biden is brain dead. He can no longer even read the teleprompter. He's consumed by the evil that he has transacted as a perpetrator to violence and genocide. So the United States is not going to stop Israel, but I believe that the Jewish people can. if the leaders of world Jewry would fly to Jerusalem, enter the Knesset, in the same way that the Republican leadership in the Senate back in 1974 with Richard Nixon demanding that he resign. The greatest imperative in the world today is to stop Netanyahu's final solution of Rafah. And I believe that the quickest route to that goal lies in the conscience of Judaism that has always stood for truth and justice and mercy. That's what came out of the loins of Abraham and Isaac and Jacob. Joshua was a psychopath then, just like Netanyahu is a psychopath now. There is never, under any circumstances, justification for genocide. And if the Jewish people do not stop it, they become as complicit as the Germans became as willing executioners to the Nazis. I'm speaking very strongly, everyone, because we're witnessing live a genocide by the very people who suffered it the most egregiously. The world cannot let that happen. We cannot let that happen. So all of us need to act in whatever way you can. Thank you, everyone. I know these are hard times. I know it's hard to look at what's happening in Gaza, but look, we must. Just like people of conscience did 100 years ago in trying to save the Jews. The ones who stood up were the heroes of their day. It's against this backdrop that we're going to be exploring flourishing. And we're going to be hearing from individuals. In many cases, they represent organizations that may or may not agree with what I have been saying. We understand that. We respect that. We honor that. We're all blind people trying to figure out the elephant. And so I want to thank our panelists today, as I will every day. I hope that you will participate in this discussion as we discuss flourishing, so that the comments that we're making on how humanity at this time of duress can still flourish has grounding in the reality out of which the discussion emerges. And to convene that discussion, I want to introduce Carson Kelly, who has been on before with Tom Eddington, who is an entrepreneur, a serial entrepreneur extraordinaire that's always been somewhere in this interface between technology and culture. He's also a teacher and professor. And so Carson has put together this week on flourishing, as other weeks coming up on Humanity Rising. So Carson, I want to thank you. I apologize in advance for the strength and the clarity of my opening statements, but that's our world today. And in that spirit, I turn the program over to you.
Okay. Thank you, Jim. And I have to say, being called a professor by you is quite a compliment. However, I'm not a professor. Maybe at some point in the future I might be, but just to clarify. But thank you for that thinking of me in that manner. I appreciate it. And thank you too also for bringing attention to into the situation, of course, in Gaza. Not a lot else needs to be said from me at this point in time on that. I appreciate, again, your siren call on this. Also want to thank you again for your invitation to be part of the Humanity Rising podcasting efforts. I really appreciate the opportunity to be able to bring forward some of my colleagues who are doing just incredible work in service of a more compassionate and flourishing world. Also, I'd like to take a moment and thank my colleague and partner in this podcasting effort, Tom Eddington. Tom couldn't be with us today, but hopefully will be joining us over the course of the next several days as his schedule allows. But he's been instrumental in bringing forward Compassion 2.0 into this conversation. And again, we appreciate being here. Compassion 2.0 is a collection of professionals who are trying to scale compassion through the intentional architecture of compassionate human experience that ultimately can be measured. We see Compassion 1.0 as traditionally being a non-secular individual virtue taught typically by a spiritual teacher. And with the advent of the MRI machine and other scientific efforts, there's an additional frame of compassion that we are recognizing, which moves from an individual virtue to include organizational principles as taught in a secular fashion. So this is something that we're focusing on. And again, trying to scale this through the intentional architecture of compassionate human experience that can be measured. We do this through creating compassionate and flourishing frameworks through both product development and organizational architecture. So this is the realm that we play in, and some of the folks in the effort with us include product developers and organizational developers and leaders, neuroscientists, behavioral scientists, UX, UI designers, entrepreneurs, venture capitalists, and more. So this week, we're going to be looking at what we're calling modern flourishing from the perspective of the global north. We recognize that our Western, more modern frame, or more organizations rather, culture and society have created great challenges for us. It's been reflected in all of the metrics in our mental and emotional well-being indicators, our societal relationships, our relationship to the environment, and more. And we have a lot to learn, particularly from the global South, for a variety of different reasons. We will be talking this week on flourishing, in particular, as it relates from the perspective of neuroscience and group relationships, individual practices, ancient wisdom, and seeing it through a modern frame, and the financial relationship between funders and founders who are trying to create new things in the world. It's really a survey of various topics. We don't expect by any means to exhaustively cover any of these things, but mostly our intention is to try to provide the listener with maybe some additional perspectives that they might not have been exposed to before, and possibly looking into some of those new perspectives that they might gain as ways in which they might bring individual flourishing to themselves. So that's our frame for the week. And as an aside, just to echo what Jim had said, the views expressed by the individuals are their own on the appearance of the program, and they do not imply an endorsement of them or any entity that they represent. So I've asked our guests to join this week over the course of time in a professional manner to discuss their work. So today I am joined by Josh Haynes, who's the co-founder at Masaba Fund. And Josh has been doing some just amazing work over the past several years that I've gotten the chance to know him, and I'm excited to have this conversation with Josh. So Josh, thank you and welcome.
Thank you, Carson, for the beautiful entry to or intro to this session. I'm excited to chat with you and learn from you, and also answer lots of questions and ask also a lot of questions as well.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, I appreciate you being here so much. So I think the first place to start is as we explore this relatively obscure topic of, founder flourishing and why that matters, is tell us a little bit, about yourself, tell us about Masawa, what brought you here, and then let's dive on in and talk about Nurture Capital.
And what does that mean? Thanks. So I'm, as you can tell from my accent, most likely I'm from North America. I was born and raised in New Mexico. I went to high school in Texas. And my first career, I was a software developer, mainly in Europe. I also had the opportunity to work in a number of emerging markets. I was a Peace Corps volunteer in Morocco. I spent time developing software in Niger, in Mozambique, Bangladesh, Haiti. And through those experiences was really curious about seeing the world through the eyes of others. Not only was I trying to, at least in my 20-year-old self, seeing that there was a gap in the information that people were receiving. Those people who were farmers, a farmer, she needs more than just information about the weather or market prices. She also needs information about a whole host of other things. But saw that technology could potentially be a solution. Well, technology isn't a solution for anything, as we know. And it's neither, it's a tool, of course. And then spent the next number of years as a diplomat in the Obama administration. I was specifically in the U.S. Agency for International Development, looking at the intersection of technology, human rights, civil society, and devising innovative capital structures so that the U.S. taxpayer dollars were not just going the old traditional way to as important as that was, but how could we actually innovate and co-create solutions? So paying for ecosystem development. As part of that, I got to manage a rather large portfolio of capital, and specifically a social impact portfolio that also allowed me to do a lot of work around the world. When my family moved to Berlin, Germany, my husband and our 2 kids, I left the U.S. government. My time had come to an end, and it was important for me to do additional things. But when I got to Germany, I had my own breakdown. I certainly wasn't flourishing. Had my own issues with mental health, my depression, anxiety. I've always suffered with issues with food, all stemming from a pretty traumatic childhood. I was raised by a single mom on welfare, so social help. And when I kind of had my own breakdown, it became clear to me that not only did I need to start doing a lot of the inner work, because my entire life was trying to prove to everybody else that I was important and that I mattered. By then I think I had worked in 37 countries. I spoke 7 languages. I had got lots of scholarships and accolade, but I was broken inside. And so this idea of the inner journey and that individuality was very raw for me. And I saw also the opportunity that technology and innovation was allowing in terms of different breakthroughs, whether it be in software or hardware or approaches or merging of these. And of course, a number of startups, early stage companies that were being created to address these mental health and mental wellness issues. And so then posited, can we actually put together an investment vehicle that allows us to invest in these companies that are catalyzing mental wellness, but not just in the traditional venture capital model? And we can talk about all of that, what's the existing paradigm, but try to make a bridge to a new paradigm or a new reality where capital was always a driving force that created more for all at all times. And so that was the genesis of Masawa, which is a derivative of the Arabic word for equality, al-musawa. And so that's a bit about myself and about the genesis of Masawa specifically.
Well, thank you, and thank you for sharing such a personal part of your story and being transparent about that. I appreciate that. Thank you. So as you then made this approach and the shift in this kind of thinking, you created Masawa, and it's really twofold as I understand it. On the one hand, the kinds of investments that you're focused on, which you touched on, if you could explain that. But then after that, let's talk about the uniqueness in terms of the founder relationship and why that matters.
Yeah, absolutely. So, this week you're talking about flourishing. I encourage all of the listeners and viewers to make sure you're very well aware of Compassion 2.0. I was fortunate, thanks to Carson's invitation, to attend in San Francisco last October, and was blown away by the authenticity and the intentionality of different types of people coming together: scientists, investors, investees, etc. At Misawa, we see there's a huge opportunity for private capital to drive more. So I'll take a step back. If you look at the current mental health crisis, which we're all living in, and I would posit to say the specific things that are happening currently in Israel and Gaza and a number of the other hotspots in the world is because of a lack of connection to oneself and then to each other and to the greater humanity. And effectively, for me, it's just a global mental health crisis. So we're looking to invest in those companies that are addressing mental illness or working to enhance neurodiversity and make it even more of a superpower than it already is. They're looking at a wide range of technology solutions or hardware, wearables that are addressing schizophrenia, severe mental illness, ADHD, bipolar, Alzheimer's, dementia, and the list goes on. If you name something, we're hopefully looking at it. We also see, though, that that's not, if we look at the 2x2 matrix, our mental health isn't, mental illness to mental wellness. There's also this idea of languishing to flourishing. And so we want to be able to invest private capital in companies that are also helping groups of populations that, because of who they are, traditionally or historically marginalized, not only in areas that you traditionally think of, like, of course, gender, sex, sexual orientation, gender identity, socioeconomic status, but also age. Elder care is a huge area that will continue to be youth, especially looking at this question I understood from last week around children and AI. There's a huge amount of opportunities there. And we're also looking to invest in the social determinants of mental health. So how your mental health isn't just, if you're mentally ill or not. It's also how you eat, how you sleep, your financial education. Frankly, it's if you don't live in a democracy, if you have agency and you have the ability to express gratitude. And so looking at investing in a number of different companies, early stage, very early companies. So why private capital? Well, we saw, and I spent a long time managing a portfolio of investing in public funding, also akin to philanthropy. Philanthropy, especially in the mental health area, is very, very small. It's less than 0.5% of the overall health philanthropy globally goes to mental health specifically. If you look at the public sector, where I came out of, usually 2% of a country's health budget is dedicated towards mental health, and that's unfortunately still focused on things like clinics or inpatient clinics. And so we don't have, unfortunately, a Marshall Plan for mental health or a DARPA for mental health. And so to fill that void, it's the private capital is what can be used. But there's a big but. Private capital, oftentimes, especially in the traditional model of venture capital, is only held accountable to one thing, and that's making more money. And so at all costs, it doesn't matter what happens. Sure, there's human relationships, right, in these investments. And Carson, you please chime in with your experience, having raised funds for the startups that you have founded yourself. We know that is actually oftentimes this private capital that, or sometimes extractive capital, it's called, or vulture capital is a joke that is often used, is counterproductive to the outcomes that the founders are and the entrepreneurs themselves are trying to reach. It leads to additional burnout. It leads to toxic work environments, and it leads to a number of things that effectively puts the business at risk, and you won't be able to have the impact that you need to have. And so Misawa is an impact fund, and for us, impact, of course, is a loaded word. An impact fund means specifically that we're held accountable to not only the financial return, we're held accountable to the social return. as well. So we have KPIs, we have goals that we set with the companies we're investing in. And if after the investment is finished, if they have not hit those goals, the social goals, then we have to forfeit some of the money that we can make, some of the profit that we can make as a fund. So I feel like, please,
Let me jump in for just a
I feel
moment.
like I'm talking too much.
Listen to you all day. I love Misawa. Let me jump in for just a second.
Yeah.
So what I'm hearing you say, I mean, how to say, extrapolating from what you're saying, which you've already spoken to explicitly around the word of extraction, is this notion, again, that private capital, particularly, that the motive really is an extractive motive in the sense of one of I want to extract either from the earth as a resource, or I want to extract from humans as a resource. I want to extract from the founder as a resource, et cetera. So it feels to me, as I understand it, and I do, I've had some experience, of course, in that world, but not to the degree that you have. But it feels like there's this chain of extraction that when you look at the notion of somebody, a well-intentioned founding team or founder, she shows up and she has the idea of being able to manifest something fabulous in the world, or something that's going to bring benefit to those that are suffering or in pain. In some cases, of course, not by all means, but in some cases that's true. But she's facing an extractive frame in her mind, at least, and or in the system, from the vulture capitalists, as you call it in that traditional sense. And of course, not all venture capitalists are like this by any means, but just broadly speaking about just a general framing as it has existed and kind of up until today, there is this extractive notion. There's this notion that the venture capitalists are seeking to gain a return from the founder, in terms of a financial reward purely, because in many times those investors are also reporting potentially to senior investors within a firm who are also evaluating their ability to measure their ability to get the extractive result. And then, of course, the entire firm is also trying to respond to limited partners who are also looking for an extractive mentality.
Right. They're investors, right? Called limited partners. Yeah.
Exactly. Those investors who are investing in the venture capital firms who then say, I will go and find great companies to invest in. And so then all along the way, then there's this extractive dominoes, if you will, in the sense you get to the founding team, to the founder, where she is doing her work. And now she's also trying to support her team and trying to bring a beautiful vision into the world. But yet it's fundamentally in juxtaposition in the case of mental well-being or social impact activities or whatever it is, where profit isn't strictly the goal, but it's how to say, it's a necessary part of the world, right? I mean, capital has to move, salaries have to be paid. Of course, everybody understands this. But at the same time, for these kinds of organizations that are trying to move the needle on changing people in their states of flourishing, be it individually and or as a group or what have you, that seems to get lost, right? So in the world of Misawa, maybe you could just speak to that just a little bit, actually, because as I'm saying that, I'm realizing, what about some of the folks that you've seen, or maybe the folks that are working with Misawa to support you? And do you have criteria, for instance, as you're looking for LPs and so on?
Yeah.
So I apologize, but go ahead. If you wouldn't mind speaking to that.
Not at all. Because I think along this extractive chain, we forget the human, which is the core element. Right? It is that founder. It is the vision that she's brought into life, the team that she's created. And on the other side, of course, it's the investors. Whether they be angel investors who are investing smaller amounts of money, or venture capitalists, which are investing larger amounts of money. And although they may have a very good and very healthy relationship, at the end of that period, when it is such that that investment has come to fruition through a number of different ways, that the only marker of success for that investor is the absolute amount of valuation, or the increase in the valuation in the money that they invest in. And so that's where a lot of this adverse or perverse relationships come in. And that's when you see incredible pressure from investors on the founders, really not taking into account that founder is not only a founder of a company, and we can talk about founder mental health in a second, and talk about a lot of the stats around founders and innovators and entrepreneurs specifically. But they oftentimes have families, or have lives as well, that also is important to be brought in. So at Misawa, I was shocked when I learned that 65% of startups that fail because of some type of human conflict. It's because internal conflict with the founders, that they really haven't done their own work, or they're not on that journey to do their work, to understand their own relationship with power, with success, with money, frankly, and not being able to have those honest conversations. Or founders who, oftentimes we see that innovators and founders are phenomenal at going from what we call 0 to 1. So being able to put the thing into the universe, but they're not the right person to grow the thing, to grow the company. And very few people can transition from being a founder to a CEO. But most people, of course, if you create something, it's yours, it's your baby. And so it's hard. So oftentimes a lot of the failure comes in startups is because that leadership transition style that's needed isn't possible for the founders. And then, of course, there's co-founder conflict. People who create the company together simply can't get along as much as they've tried, and they're not willing, frankly, to lead through their own vulnerability, or let alone trying to lead through their empathetic nature. And so that's a huge amount of failure that can happen that it doesn't make sense. And so at Masawa, we're looking to specifically not only invest in those founders who are coachable, who can lead through their vulnerability and wants to go on their own leadership journey. But then we're actually, for the first year after investment, we're providing services, whether it be therapy, co-founder coaching, a whole sorts of products or approaches that we co-create as a team with the founders to address any of their largest blind spots. It ranges, it's quite wide, because at this time in a company's especially in early stage companies' life, money is scarce, time is scarce, and so as an investor coming in and saying, yes, we're going to invest in your company and we're going to pay for these services, then I think that's a huge win for everyone all around. Because as an investor, I'm trying to kind of minimize the risk that the company is going to fail. In the funds that we are currently working on and investing out of and fundraising all at the same time, we plan to have about 25 companies that we're invested in the mental health space. And so in a traditional venture capital fund, it's upwards of 80 to 90% of those companies that fail. And that's completely normal. So that doesn't sit well with me, especially knowing really the deep whys, the deep purposes of these founders and their incredible expertise. And so if we're able to not focus on, right, this word of unicorn is usually bandied around. A unicorn, of course, is a company that has $1 billion valuation. But a lot of the companies who are unicorns, Uber, name a lot of the top companies that you think of, aren't necessarily profitable. And I say that those are unicorns who are on steroids. If we're focusing on a company that has $1 billion valuation, I also want that company to address the issues of 1 billion people. And so that it's, jokingly, I say grass-fed or grass-fed as a unicorn.
Yeah, that's very funny.
And just in terms of the math, if I am able to have a number of companies that do well, not incredibly well, that actually in aggregate is a lot better than if I only have 1 or 2 companies do well in my portfolio.
Yeah. So I just so admire and appreciate your perspective. And as I'm hearing you, we've talked about this on many different occasions in different contexts. And the 65% number in terms of failure as a result of founder conflict of some sort, that is just unbelievable. If you just extrapolate that for a moment and spend some time, what is the total amount of money that's invested in companies in the year, over the course of a year, over the course of the world? If we just think about that for a minute, I don't know what the numbers are, but I'm sure they're very large. I'm sure they're massive. And to think that 65% of that number just evaporates, in a sense that the mission isn't realized, the team, the individuals and their families that are part of that team, et cetera, are no longer employed. And again, really bigger. Again, the mission isn't the value that they're trying to bring to the world isn't truly manifested in the sense of goodness and well-being that they're trying to produce in some way, be it act or mental illness or what have you. That's appalling, in a sense. That is, how to say, appalling, I think is probably the wrong word. It's just terribly unfortunate that individuals suffering, that we as a humans, as just on the planet together collectively, that, how to say, it's unfortunate that we aren't yet in a frame that allows for greater compassion and greater self-compassion and the ability for people to work together at that choke point, if you will, of where the capital comes into, her team and herself and so forth, that the harmoniousness and the relationships there can't have greater self-compassion to create greater harmony and greater flow. I'm not sure of my words here, if this is making sense.
Absolutely. Because what happens is that then there's a system of scarcity that is built. And we all know, well, especially this group of people, we know what happens when you're living in a system of scarcity and not a system of abundance. And what can emerge, what can be manifested, allowing serendipity to come in, all of these very important things that, luck is probably the number one thing in terms of the success of a company at the end of the day. And timing is just a function of luck. And so I think, at least that's how we see it. We were appalled, but we're also appalled around the linearity of the existing system, where I invest in you, and even as an impact fund, many impact funds say, okay, return to me capital, thank you, and then also return, hit these social impact or social goals or climate goals that you may have had, and then we're done with the relationship, and we go our separate ways. We feel that actually doesn't get us to that next level. And so we have a couple of elements that we're bringing in for this nurture capital approach that we're taking that looks at the founder as a forever relationship opportunity. So, for example, if a founder transitions out, right? Maybe you can talk about your experience transitioning out of your previous companies. There are usually three ways that a founder leaves their company. Is because they were incredibly financially successful, they were the opposite, the company failed, or there was a succession, either happily or not happily. In each of these instances, the founder, on the day after they've left their company, is really in a deep hole when it comes to their mental health, oftentimes, if they're not well prepared for it. I think it's important for us as an investor to see this coming and to provide a type of soft landing package so that when this transition happens, that we're able to provide services to help them not only get closure on what's just happened. Oftentimes, it's people indicate that it's akin to losing a baby or something of that magnitude of these companies. But we also want to make sure and help these founders get back on their feet and back to innovating, so that we can potentially invest in them, they can invest in us, we can do additional stuff together.
Yeah.
And that's just one very small thing that doesn't cost a lot of money to help not to go from founder flourishing to also systemic flourishing. So it's not that a founder will definitely want us to invest in them because of this chance of the soft landing package. They just know that we're with them. And it's, everyone says, I got your back. Well, what does that really mean?
Yeah. That makes sense. To me, you're painting this beautiful picture of this generative relationship as opposed to an extractive relationship. And
indeed,
and I think that it really points to a real larger question, for me at least, just from a philosophical perspective. I've been thinking quite a bit about this. When you think about it, typically not everybody, but most folks that are limited partners, as I understand it, in providing capital to a venture capital firm or what have you, or angel investors or what have you, by default are in a financial position where they're able to do that. So that they more than likely are in a position where their immediate needs are taken care of. They probably have a certain amount of luxury that they've chosen, depending on what their personal choices are. But there's a certain amount of safety and there's a certain amount of financial security that is in front of people who can make those choices to then move massive amounts of capital from themselves to somebody else. And I think what is challenging to me is thinking about that from the perspective of how can that be reframed from an extractive intention and desire to a place of deep gratitude and appreciation an acknowledgement of the removal of at least a certain range of financial challenge-based suffering. Not to say that people, of course, who have had capital or wealth at that scale, at some scale where they have the ability to invest. Of course, we're all human, and just like me, everyone has pain. What depends on what it is, of course, how it shows up. But regardless of that, and acknowledging that, there still can be this notion of just being grateful for a moment, of just saying, I have this. And instead of thinking about an extractive frame of now I want more, or I'm desiring of something for whatever their reasons might be. I'm not here to judge or have a perspective on that, but is there a way to reframe that relationship so capital moves from a place of generative flowing forward in a manner, as opposed to an extractive, what can I get back? Because at the end of the day, when capital translates into manifestation, a la a founding team as midwived by, say, a venture firm or angel investors and or the founder, when she brings her team together and brings those financial relationships together to bring that manifestation of a company or an organization. And I should also be mindful too, it's not so much just about for-profit organizations that we're talking about. I know just trying to clarify for the listener. It's about any organization, be it an NGO or anybody. But anytime anybody comes together to try to then concentrate their will, if you will, into making something better for the world, it's that movement that is very fascinating, and it feels to me that a fundamental element of it, again, like we were outlining before, is this extractive frame of it currently, where it's how can I take from the future and get something back to myself, as opposed to how might, from a place of deep gratitude and appreciation for at least the financial benefits I'm surrounding myself, or I've been surrounded by, how do I push that forward? So that was very wordy. Apologies, but I'd love to get your thoughts.
I think oftentimes we talk about how can we. I also did that a lot, and so in this specific area, now we've developed two innovations in how the fund is structured to address this specifically. The first is the solidarity aspect, that we're all in this together. So not only if a founder is very successful, that they individually and their team will be financially well, but if they're not, what happens? If they're the first, they're not the investors. They're taking incredible risk to bring their ideas and product and services to life. But if they fail, they walk away with nothing necessarily. What we've done, or what we're doing at Masawa, is we have what we call solidarity capital. So 10% of our profits that we could make are going back to our founders. So that means that they're not only, if they fail, that they still financially can be remunerated for some of that risk they're taking, but it also increases the accountability to each other, right? Because a failed founder is really also hoping or banking on that there's a successful founder, and successful founders are hoping that everyone is successful. So it's a way to kind of psychologically add a bit more. The word I was looking at the logo for Ubiquity University, and the first thing that came to mind was Ubuntu, right? This idea that we are together, we are a team. And then the second thing that we're doing specifically is around this idea of knowing what's enough. When is something enough? And so we actually have put into something called a carry cap. So carried interest is another word for the profit that a fund can make, an investment fund can make. And so we've capped the amount of money that we as the individuals in the fund can make. And if we do go above that, if we have higher profits, then all of that money will be donated to a foundation that is driven by or programmed by ourselves, our investees, and our investors as a community. And that doesn't necessarily have to be about investing in companies for a financial and social return. It could be grants, it could be a whole host of other things. And I think this is a way that we then, even at this point when we're relatively early in our life cycle, that we can come together for something that's bigger than ourselves, and knowing what's enough. this whole first fund that we have is really testing this hypothesis. If you nurture capital, will it lead to better and more impactful outcomes? I want to talk a second about the nonprofit side. As I spent almost 7 years as funding nonprofits and NGOs around the world, well, both in the United States and in many emerging markets. And I saw accountability really was oftentimes, I mean, there was very rarely is there any focus on the leader's well-being or the team's well-being, as when there's no accountability to that as such. But I always wondered if we could do something as someone in philanthropy or who's the grant giver, if certain goals were achieved, would there be actually personal bonuses or remuneration that could be had? Yes, that's a game, that's a system that can be gamed in a number of things. But I'm sure there are a number of different elements that if we put our head together that we could innovate on aligning the accountability with the intentionality. And I think in all of this, it's something that we're still lacking because it's about maximizing growth at all costs, and instead of maximizing value at, I don't know the right word, but at something cost. I don't know. Maybe we can play on that, or maybe some people watching this have suggestions. I think that's super important and powerful that we're just a bit more honest about that. Yeah.
Yeah. It's such an interesting thing just overall, just, thinking about this, like, again, because it's such an obscure little part of the world, but yet it shows up in such massive implications in the sense of most people don't understand. Like, for instance, I mean, just as an aside, I just keep going back to the 65% number. Like, my word, if that was resolvable in some way, just think about the amount of capital that could be deployed in such beneficial and ongoing fashion. Like, it just wouldn't be wasted. And unfortunately too, as you mentioned earlier, there's so many traditional venture firms out there that literally will bet on 100 different companies to the tune of $1 million or $2 million or more each, and then at the same time knowing that two of them might hit and get their returns to cover their losses on all these other things. It's just this constant extractive notion of the accumulation of capital, into what end ultimately, really? Because value, to your point, is not, it's so much more than money. I mean, it is so much more. And into our earlier point of our framing of this conversation, particularly in the global north, we have so just lost that. Not to make broad generalizations, but there's so many other cultures and societies that haven't lost that and understand the importance of relationship and the importance of family and friends and community and everything that goes involved with that, and the richness and the texture of that value can often get overshadowed by this desirous consumptive thing where the ultimate goal is what? To have gilded toilets on a Gulfstream 6? Like, it's absurd. It's absolutely ridiculous. Anyway, I should probably chill out here a little.
I think no worries. I think fundamentally, if we look at who gets to choose where capital moves, effectively who has power and the capital flows, unfortunately, it's a very homogenous group of people traditionally, right? And this is something that we as a fund have seen. My background, I was raised by a single mom on welfare, so I'm from the lowest, probably 5th or 10th percentile, of the, at least of the United States. I'm in the LGBT group. I have done amazing things, and so really have been able to transverse different castes. And my co-founder, so my partner in the fund as well, Sabine Plichet, she's French, lives in Munich. And so we also see oftentimes when we're going to talk to potential investors to invest in our fund, they look at us regardless of where, our track record, the innovations we've done, the structure, the innovative structuring of the fund. And they see that, we didn't go to the right schools. We don't have maybe the right name. We're not coming suggested by specific families. And so we haven't earned, or we don't have the golden ticket to decide where capital moves. Just recently, and I won't say who, there was a very large public funder in Europe who indicated because we didn't have the right type of track record, although as a team, we've invested in 137 countries, tens of millions of dollars, yada yada yada. That's not something that the public funders would be able to invest in us at this point. And so it was a question of well, who gets to decide, who has the power to make these decisions? And this is, of course, not only in returnable capital, but also in philanthropy and those moving major capital. And so that's why I'm incredibly passionate about making sure that we're giving, I have to say, this innovative structure that we have at Massawa, and even the idea of focusing on mental health, which now is becoming, people are realizing that it's a good investment opportunity. I'm the source of this. I originated it, and if I had a venture capital background, I probably wouldn't have been able to do this, to come up with this. So it's this importance of diversity of all things, in terms of me and us trying to take that power and saying, no, we're actually investing in a different way.
When you are finding people to work with, do you have how to say, and I don't want to put you on the spot, but maybe I'll put you on the spot. Are you finding that there's a certain kind of person that tends to resonate with this forward thinking as it relates to nurture capital?
Certainly. Oftentimes it's individuals who feel, in terms of their own legacy, that it's not, with a traditional investment methodology, they're not going to be able to have the type of legacy that they want to leave behind. So these are individuals who come from a lineage of wealth. That's the first type. The second type are individuals who have been very successful financially because of their own entrepreneurial journeys, but they wish they had an investor who nurtured the capital that was invested, that really cared about the founder well-being and their ability to create these abundance-rich organizations. And so that certainly resonates. And so that's the main group of individuals or family offices, or even, so there are things called funds of funds, so funds that specifically invest in other funds. They can get complicated. Who certainly understand from both a financial and a social aspect why nurture capital can lead to better outcomes.
Interesting. Yeah, I'm just trying to understand just these meta patterns that are playing out, and ego attachment and these kinds of things, that how that they then manifest in these sorts of decisions. And then, of course, this accumulation of the capital coming into the hands of a few. And of course, there's a very large argument that's ongoing. And I've been reading a absolutely brilliant book called Post-Capitalist Philanthropy. I don't know. Do you know that one by chance? Have you?
I know of it. I haven't read it. Yep.
Unbelievably brilliant. I look forward to at some point getting into a conversation. Yeah, it's unfortunate that there is an argument that lots of accumulation, the accumulators of the wealth, of course, create the destruction by which they extract and accumulate capital, and then turn around later and then decide how that capital is then redistributed to try to fix the problems that arguably they've made. And I know that this shows up at one level, and even in discussions around artificial intelligence. Is that a beneficial thing? Is big tech developing AI and then turning around and creating empathic or other sorts of AI that might be helpful to people, but then who's to decide, and so on. And all of these things are very nuanced. In the case of AI, there's broad arguments that might be true, but at the same time, there's also very specific examples where that's not true. So anyway, a lot of this is nuanced, and it's difficult that so much capital is accumulated. I mean, one thing that really struck me too that I'd like to share with the audience is I read a statistic, and I hope this is correct, and forgive me if it isn't, but that roughly 25 or 30 years ago, the top 400 wealth holders, rather, in the United States had an accumulated capital value of $1.5 trillion. Trillion with a T, 400 trillion. Fast forward X amount of years later, that number is now up to $4.5 trillion. So the change and the continued accumulation and concentration of wealth as it continues to go up the chain is really quite astounding. And then, of course, you have to look at where is that coming from? How, and if we look around at our society and our earth and our world and our relationships and so forth, there's incredible mental illness, incredible rates of loneliness, incredible environmental destruction. I mean, there's just so much of, be it social media, be it consumptive practices, whatever it might be. We look around at the results, and at least in the global north and the Western frame, haven't done really a great job. And we've done that at the expense of so many other individuals and societies and cultures on the planet. It's just so incredibly out of balance. Anyway, I don't mean to go sidebar too hard on this.
No.
It's very discouraging. And it just feels to me that, fundamentally at its core is that we really need to lean into our pro-social nature. We really need to start with some self-compassion to alleviate and allow our own selves to be in pain. And then from there, move forward and recognize others that are in pain and try to bring benefit to them and balance this. And I don't know where else to start. So anyway, thoughts on
modeling? I think we have to model that which we want to see, which is what we're trying to do at the fund. Specific at Masawa. So we need to model the pain. It is a what do they say, an omens battle journey. I'm not sure the right old English where to try to raise a fund, specifically an impact fund that's investing in something as seemingly esoteric, although quite generalist, as mental health, and then using a very odd or different or approach, because I think all of us in this room, it makes complete sense, but that's just so foreign to the traditional individuals who access power. I think something else, I'm going to transition into a discussion around founder mental health in general, and founder flourishing. I think it's important that we kind of highlight some of the work of Dr. Michael Freeman out of San Francisco, who did some important research on founders, so those who are starting companies, and their rates of mental health issues as compared to the normal population. And he found that founders are twice as likely or 3 times as likely to have severe depression, suicidal ideation, and addictive personalities. He also found them to have 6 times higher rates of ADHD and 10 times higher likely to have bipolar disorder. And so this is an interesting, essentially, founders, because of the risk nature, not because of the risk nature. I think inherently they're born, and I'm one of them. I've been an entrepreneur and entrepreneur. I've now founded this fund. It definitely resonates with me. You're there too, Carson. I think probably a lot of us are there. That it's we have to use this idea of our mental health or our mental health challenges as superpowers.
Right.
Something that's really important for me that we talk a lot more about is the neurodiversity around founders. 30% of self-made millionaires are dyslexic. And I joke sometimes that both my husband and my daughter are dyslexic, so I won the lottery. Maybe I won't need to. But I mean, it's an important thing, so that if I'm an investor and I see a pitch deck coming across my desk that has a lot of spelling errors or other errors, I don't just throw it in the trash because of this idea of laziness, but something that excites me because I want to know more. So there's incredible superpowers specifically for founders, and we've spoken to, and your experience is quite robust as well. Would investors acknowledge that a founder might have issues like anxiety, depression, ADHD, whatever that might be? It's that builds the trust so strongly together, so it's not seen as something that they have to hide under the rug, and can actually help, I guess, the relationship, so that when things are getting tricky in the business, that the founder is done and at their wit's end. That as the investor, we can make sure that we are putting the impact and the returns that we're looking for. We can be able to act more quickly.
I think your point, I mean, again, it just creates, you're speaking to, as in my interpretation of it, again, this generative frame of how capital can move and supporting the unique individual that takes the effort and the incredible risk and the incredible fear of diving into something unknown to make something that doesn't exist at that point in time to actually manifest something like that, of which hopefully more and more people can gain benefit from. It is phenomenally difficult to undertake that effort. So in the face of that, the fears from my own experience are massive and overwhelming and tremendous. And yet at the same time, you still do it for some god awful reason. Who knows why? But hopefully you can do something to ultimately bring benefit. And I think it's important that you speak to that. And there is more important. I'm not sorry. There's more discussion rather about founder mental well-being. There's the founder's mental health pledge, I believe, is a I think that's the correct title, but something like that. With the number of founders who've come together to sign a statement to support other founders in those with those challenges. Another colleague of ours who has her role is to look specifically at founder health, and she's situated in a venture capital firm that is focused on bringing financial equity and financial access to financial markets and tools and so forth to founders who are working all over the globe. And her role is specifically to focus on that and to bring that greater relationship of transparency and support between the founders and the investors. So anyway, there's work that's starting to happen, which I think is so incredibly important. And again, it's obscure because I know lots of people who aren't founders or haven't been in this space, be it opening a business on downtown wherever, if it's a wine bar or something, or all the way to creating something that is platform based, like what Steve Jobs did with the iPhone, and thinking about how many lives that's changed and touched, both positively and negatively, of course, just like everything. But anyway, I'm glad you brought that up. I think that's incredibly important to speak to that. And what you're doing at Misawa is just super cool as far as I'm concerned. I want to be mindful of our time. Did you have anything else, Josh, that you wanted to share today, or anything that's up for you in terms of what you're thinking about, or things that going on?
I think about oftentimes, maybe too often, we think about, well, this is how the system is, and this is how we want it to be. And so I think the next time you think about that, or you think like that, like what are the concrete things you can do with your own agency to be able to change that? Because just bitching about it doesn't get us very far. Although that's fun sometimes. I don't mind a good bitch session. That's always cathartic sometimes. I think also something that I'm really trying to drive in on is this idea of power holders and what will break the floodgates in terms of getting more capital, not only to funds like ours, but there's so many different organizations, and I'll name a few of them in a second, who are doing really catalytic work around ensuring that capital can regenerate, can be repurposed, can essentially reach all ends of the earth. And so who are those individuals who, because of who they are or their histories, have incredible access to money and power? And how can they become more brave? Can they become braver, I guess in English you would say, and to be able to invest in not just not for profits, that's important too, but also in companies where there's a different incentive model, right? So where is I'm blinking on her name, an incredible woman who is putting most of her wealth into investing in nonprofit organizations in the US, and she's getting all the publicity. Yes. McKinsey. Yeah, Scott. Thank you. And so is there a McKinsey Scott or of that ilk who's willing to say, when I'm dead, it's all gone anyways. Right. So let's try to speed this ship up. Yeah. And I think that's kind of a call to not only investing in, we're structured as a traditional venture capital funds, and we're investing in companies and equity, and we're a bit limited because of regulations of what we can do. But there are other amazing organizations like Zebras United. The Zebra movement is a movement of startup where they're not looking at 10xing. They're looking at getting a 10x multiple on the invested capital that they have. They would be happy with 2 to 5x. So check out Zebras United, an important area. There's the steward ownership model, which is a model of company formation that's separating the economic and the voting rights. So companies like Patagonia is a very famous American, well, now a very famous steward-owned company. That's an important different type of governance structure that can really bring a lot. There's an organization that we are partnered with called the Purpose Foundation, which is helping companies, small and large, to become steward-owned organizations. And so that's just a couple of structural organizations that are trying to help move us all along to that next whatever it is. Someone in the questions asked, thank you for the links. Libras United, that would be great. You can only be a Libra to join Libras United. No, Zebras United or Zebras United. Thank you, Leo, for pointing that. Someone asked about the B Corp. I think B Corp is a good baseline to assess an intentionality of a company. It's not a gold standard, though. If I'm looking at a company and I don't think, companies I'm investing in, they don't need to unless it's part of their vision and their mission and it helps to really codify that. But I think it's done a great work. Same thing with this new innovations around public benefit corporations in the US, which I think can be very helpful, which you know about, Carson. And then also, I think oftentimes we forget about investing in research. Research is so incredible, useful, and investing and not knowing what's going to happen after the research. So, some of the work that you're doing, Carson, is powerful, and that's something we would eventually love to be able to do, to invest in researchers, and regardless of the ability for them to materialize their research into a business model. And that's something, of course, that others can help out with if it makes sense. But there's a lot of fun things that need to happen.
Set me up. Speaking of research and speaking of independence labs, tomorrow we will be hosting in part Felix Scholler and Nico Regente from the Institute for Advanced Consciousness Studies. This is an independent neuroscience lab in Santa Monica that are doing unbelievable work around empathy and perspective taking. And tomorrow we're going to be talking specifically about aesthetic chills and also maladaptive schemas. So very excited about that. Also talking tomorrow too with two doctors from a company called Ceity Health that have created a scientifically validated way to surface your core intentions and to understand them so that you can create a greater resonance with yourself. So anyway, that's coming up tomorrow. But to your earlier point around the scientific research support, the Institute for Advanced Consciousness Studies is an independent lab and also seeks to move off of the traditional grant funding into community support consciousness neuroscience. So I'll be talking about that tomorrow too. But anyway, so thank you, Josh. And Jim, I'm so glad you jumped back on. I was just about to ask you to do so. And I'll turn it back over to you. Thank you.
Yeah, when you were starting to tee up tomorrow, I thought I better jump in. Yeah, thank you, Josh. I must say, as a founder, I've been listening very attentively to what you had to say because, it's founder syndrome is a reality. And the timing of one's exit in many ways is as if not more important than the timing of one's entrance. Because you can ruin your entrance because you get the timing of your exit wrong.
Yep.
And I just completed an 18-month process of transitioning. I came into the university in February, actually, of 2005, and then realized several years ago it was really time for me personally to transcend being, the chief executive. But the first two attempts to transition didn't work. So it's really an art form to get the right energetic quality to really empower the founder to go into the next phase. And so I really want to thank you for your your various comments, especially the idea of a fund to help founders, into their next phase. I was extremely fortunate because I ended up connecting with the New Paradigm Institute, and I'm finding myself in Washington, but also I continue to work as president of Ubiquity and have functions with Ubiquity like Humanity Rising, but I don't have any of the executive headaches of payroll and the fundraising and all the other things that keep a founder up at 3 o'clock in the morning. And the one thing I would say about a founder is it's one of those jobs which is 24/7, 365. I think that's what's wearing on the shoulders of a founder, is the omnipresent sense of responsibility for the viability of the enterprise that really no one else feels in the same way. And so I just wanted to thank you for your comments. They were very, very potent for my understanding. And what I would just add, and then anything you want to say finally, I realized that there's similarities between being a post-founder with being a grandparent. I just had my first grandchild, little Charlie.
Beautiful.
And I realized when I was reflecting on what it was like holding him, that it was a similar feeling when I stopped being the chief executive of Ubiquity University after nearly 20 years. It was such a relief to put the baby down and, walk away.
No diapers either, right?
Somebody else was actually in charge for the 24/7, 365 part.
Yeah. That's what I've
So anyway, those are some comments that I make in a somewhat
Beautiful.
lighthearted way, but why don't you make whatever comments you'd like to make, and then Carson, you can wrap it up.
Okay, very good.
Yes, I think we all aspire to get to the grandparent stage in our companies, and be able to enjoy the fruits of what we're building, because oftentimes the organizations that we're leading are important incubation grounds for other innovations to come. And that people learn and experience, especially if some of your first experiences are in very healthy cultures and environments. You're more likely to go off if you create your own or work in others, ensure that the DNA of those companies are also one where individuals and employees can feel senses of belonging, coherence, and agency, and all these other things that we know are so fundamental to success. These, unfortunately, soft skills, which I think we need a new name for, that really drive us to value creation at the end of the day. So thank you for those comments, and thank you also for the kind invitation to have me and Masala on.
Yeah. And Josh, thank you for coming. And Jim, thank you again for allowing us the space to be able to explore some of these topics. I think my last comments again are, it takes a lot to manifest something in the world where there's something doesn't exist to when it does exist, and for it to be able to scale and to bring benefit to many, many thousands or hundreds of thousands or even millions of people. That is just no small feat by any means. And being able to recalibrate the intentionality of accumulated wealth and capital that represents many thousands of hours of other human beings' work and or fear and or efforts, as it gets concentrated into these hands of fewer and fewer people. To Josh's point, like, how do we get that floodgate to open, and how do we release that energy in a fashion that brings greater harmony and or support to future manifestations, so that, be it for-profit, nonprofit, it doesn't matter, as long as this ability to redirect this capital into benefit for others. It's time. It's time. We have figured out how to produce food for the entire planet. We can protect the planet. We can do everything we need to do. So let's just lean into our pro-social nature and just embrace it, and starting with compassion for self. So anyway, I'll get off my horse, but those are my last comments. So thank you, Josh, for your work.
And thank you, Carson, for your concluding comments. It's a horse we all need to be riding right now, is the retrieval of rapacious capitalism into pro-social capitalism. It can be done.
Absolutely.
You can have people, planet, and profit. You just need a sense of proportionality.
Yeah.
That's really at the heart of compassion, is proportionality. You suffer, I suffer. You flourish, I flourish. It's that loving one's neighbor as one loves oneself. That's really proportionality, if you think about it at its most fundamental sense. And it's the loss of that into some bizarre zero-sum game that has caused, the political economy of the world to kind of lose its way. And both of you are trying to bring us back. So thank you both for that. And Josh, I wish you all the best in everything that you're doing. You're doing good stuff, really good stuff.
Thank you.
So thank you. You're all welcome to the after session chat. You'll see the link in the chat box, and you receive the link in your Zoom reminders for the session today. And then we'll see you all here again tomorrow for our second of 5 programs on flourishing in the modern world. Thank you, Carson. Thank you, Josh.
Thank you.
Bye, everyone. See you tomorrow.